Hey, A-pushers! Hope everything is going well. So now we're going to deal with the end of the Civil War, the long way back. Reconstruction, a lot of effort, little return. All right, full disclosure here, guys. Of everything that I teach in A-push, and I love teaching A-push, and I love teaching American history. I just love history in general. Of everything that I do, Reconstruction is by far my least favorite thing to teach. I hate Reconstruction. Why do I hate Reconstruction, you ask? Well, because it's a lot of effort for very little return, right? That's what the title says. The North is trying to figure out how do we bring the country back together, and they have all these ideas, and all the ideas, there's a lot of political infighting, and all this work is being done, and the South is kind of fighting against it, but the South is also falling apart at the same time, and everybody kind of knows what they need to do, but nobody really seems to be willing to actually do it, and nothing gets done. At the end of the day, after years and years of trying to bring the country back together, it really never gets completely done. And it's going to take 100 years to kind of get to where Reconstruction wanted to get. Oh, a lot of stuff happens. Very little is important. Well, it's not important. I shouldn't say that. It is important. Just a lot of stuff happens. It just, not a lot changes, let's say that. All right, so let's just get into it. Here we go. So after the Civil War, as the North is trying to figure out how do we bring the South back into the country, Lincoln certainly has a plan, the 10% plan, which is a pretty simple, pretty easy plan for bringing the South back in. Radical Republicans, this group in the Republican Party, who believe that this war was only about ending slavery, and they want to punish the South for slavery and for the war itself, and they didn't like Lincoln's plan. Well, then Lincoln gets killed, and in comes his vice president who's got his own plan, and the Radical Republicans don't like that, and then the Radical Republicans have their plan, and so you've got all of this political infighting taking place in the North, and nobody really seems to have a clear vision about how to do this. Meanwhile, the South is just in complete shambles. The South never had the infrastructure that the North had. They didn't have the factories. They don't have the roads. They don't have the canals. They don't have the railroads. They don't have all this stuff that the North has. South never really had that. And now after the Civil War, the South is even worse shape because the battles have destroyed their farmlands and what little roads they had. And so the South is in even worse shape. And the South is in terrible political and economic shape at this time. So there's just it's just very confusing and very chaotic at this time. So while all this is happening, there are some Northerners who go, hey, I've got some money. The North doesn't seem to know what they're doing. The South is just in complete shambles. I can go to the South, and I can buy land pretty cheap. And then I can use that land to make myself even richer. I can start businesses down there. The South doesn't have really money to start any new businesses to speak of. I could go take advantage of this. So these Northerners begin moving to the South to take advantage of the situation. These Northerners are known as carpetbaggers, right? And nobody likes the carpetbaggers. Northerners didn't like the carpetbaggers. Southerners definitely didn't like carpetbaggers. Now, they're called carpetbaggers because back then, their luggage, their suitcases are not like suitcases that we would know of or think of today. Very often, their suitcases were just scraps of old carpet that had been kind of sewed into a bag, and then they would put a metal clasp on it. And they would just throw their clothes in there, and that would be their suitcase. You can see it in the cartoon here, right? These are carpet bags. These are bags made out of carpet, and that's how they get the name. So these guys were going down there with these carpetbags of all their belongings and then taking advantage of the political and economic instability in the South to make themselves richer. They really don't care what happens to the South. They're not interested in the political or economic stability of the South. They're just interested in them making some money. Now, there are some important things that do take place right after the Civil War. There's what I call the stair-step amendments, where they all kind of build, all these amendments build on one another, right? The first stair-step amendment is known as the 13th Amendment, and it's passed right after the end of the Civil War. And it's December 6th, 1865. 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. You can no longer have slaves. In order for the South, for a Southern state to come back into the Union, they're going to have to ratify the 13th Amendment. So that's important. That's the first of the stair-step amendments. No slaves. All right. So let's get into what happens after Lincoln dies. Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, who is now president, also wants to make it as easy as possible for the South to come in. Now, let's talk about Johnson for a second. Andrew Johnson is a Southerner. Okay? He is from the South, and he is a former Democrat who left the Democrats over secession. He didn't support secession. Now, Johnson he may not support slavery, but he definitely doesn't see African Americans as being equal. And so he's very racist, but he doesn't necessarily support slavery, and he definitely didn't support secession. And he's brought on as Lincoln's vice president in 1864 in hopes that it would appease the South and make it easier for the South to accept Lincoln as their president if his vice president was a Southerner. All right, well, then Lincoln dies, and in comes Johnson. Now, Johnson has no formal education. Johnson has never been to school. Johnson literally cannot read or write until he's in his mid-20s, and his wife teaches him how to read and write. He's a tailor by trade, so he made clothing by trade. He grew up very, very poor. He's definitely not a wealthy man as president, but he's definitely not poor either. But he absolutely hates rich Southerners. And he wants to punish rich Southerners. Other Southerners, not so much. So Johnson wants to bring the South back into the country as quickly and as easily as possible, just like Lincoln did. But if the radical Republicans hated Lincoln's 10% plan, they are going to be absolutely astounded and immensely angry with Johnson's plan. Johnson wants all Southerners to be able to get their land back, right? Remember, Lincoln said top-ranking Confederate officials could not get their property back. Johnson said, all Southerners can get their land back, and they can hold office, right? Which was another difference from Lincoln's plan. Lincoln said top-ranking Confederate officials can never be elected to office again. Johnson said, why not? Let them in. They just got to say that they'll follow the laws of the United States. But if they were people who fought against the country and led the South in secession, it doesn't matter. Oh boy. They are going to have to ratify the 13th Amendment if they want in. So that's something that the radical Republicans like. Southern states have to say, yep, slavery is against the law. We don't accept slavery. Now, Johnson really wants poor Southerners, people like him, to take control of the South. He hated rich Southerners, and he felt like he was poor because of rich Southerners. Rich Southerners kind of kept him down. So he has this vendetta, this drive for revenge against people he saw as being bad to him, treating him bad before he went into politics. So he wants the poor white Southerners to take control. Also, going along that theme, Johnson says anybody who's worth more than $20,000 in terms of property and money can't ever vote. Okay? So again, that's another punishment against the South. $20,000, you would have been rich back then. And so that's just how he's going to make sure rich white Southerners don't control the South. It's going to be poor Southerners, because if you're rich, you can't even vote. However, if you say some nice things about Johnson and, I don't know, slip him a couple of bills, Johnson would give you a presidential pardon. If you said, yeah, I think you're a good guy, President Johnson would say, yeah, okay, even though you're rich and I don't like you, I'm going to pardon you. I'm going to say you're a good guy, and you can go ahead and vote now, and you can go ahead and get your property back. He gives out over 13,000 presidential pardons. Whew. And in doing so, he begins to allow high-ranking Confederate officials to begin to come back to power in the South. Oh, boy. And as the Confederates, these old Confederate officials and leaders begin to come back to power, things begin to unravel in the South in terms of what it's like after the Civil War. Lots of Confederates begin to get elected back into Congress and state legislatures. A lot of Southern states, because now they're having Confederate officials elected back into their state legislatures, a lot of them refuse to ratify the 13th Amendment, say they're not going to approve the amendment that outlaws slavery. Oh, boy. And a lot of Southern states begin to pass what are known as black codes. So the black codes were these laws that were designed to get around the 13th Amendment, right? That, okay, even if the federal government says you're free, even though we don't agree with that, even though the Southern government or the United States government says that we can no longer have slaves, you're going to be treated as a slave. So it did things like segregated public places, okay? Bars and restaurants and stores segregated. There is the white entrance, there is the black entrance. There is the white section, there is the black section. They prohibited interracial marriage. Now, it didn't happen a lot back then, but there were some people back then who were willing to date interracially or even marry interracially. That was not going to happen. Prohibited blacks from testifying against whites in court. So if a white abused or beat up or robbed or whatever a black citizen, they couldn't testify in court against the white. Meaning, essentially, the whites could do whatever they wanted to do. Southern whites could do whatever they wanted to do to Southern blacks because the Southern black could never testify against them in court. It requires blacks, new slaves, to buy, or newly freed slaves, to buy special licenses to do non-agricultural work. So if they're not going to work in the field, if they're going to go into carpentry or something like that, they had to buy special licenses that would allow them to do that. Southern whites didn't need to buy these licenses, but newly freed slaves needed to. Big problem. These newly freed slaves have no money. Oh, well, that's too bad, because now you can't buy the license, so you can't go do that work. If you didn't have a job, you would be arrested for vagrancy. Basically, you would be arrested for just hanging around, supposedly causing problems. If you didn't have a job, you would be arrested. Problem was, a lot of people didn't want to hire newly freed slaves because of the prejudice that was so rampant in the South at that time. It was really, really hard for newly freed slaves to get a job. If they couldn't get a job, they'd be arrested. Oh, boy. And so all of these black codes give rise to a new type of segment of the economy, I guess, called sharecropping. And sharecropping is actually still around today, and it's a brutal system. There's a picture of some sharecroppers there. So here's what happens. Because Johnson has just given out presidential pardons to former Confederates and wealthy Southerners, like it's candy, a lot of these plantation owners begin to get their land back that was taken away from them during the Civil War. And then you have the carpetbaggers who are coming in, and they're buying up a lot of this land, a lot of this agricultural land, because it's so cheap. They could buy up these huge pieces of property for very little money. Okay. And then the sharecroppers and former plantation owners begin to use this new economic system called sharecropping. So here's what would happen. These families who couldn't find a job because they couldn't buy these non-agricultural licenses or whatever, they would go back to very, very often, these former slaves would go back to their plantation owners, to their former owners. And the former owners or the carpetbaggers would give the family a little plot of land, right, to farm. They would tell them, I'll let you farm this plot of land, right? I own all of this land here. I'll give you this little section here for you to farm. Okay. And you just pay me rent for living there. How are they going to pay rent? They were going to pay rent through the crops that they grew, right? So they grow cotton or whatever it is that they're growing. They're going to give some of that crop to their landlord, former plantation owner or carpetbagger, to sell, and that would how they would pay their rent. Okay. Now, the sharecroppers, you certainly need tools, you need seed, and you need other things to make things grow. Well, they don't have the means to buy those things, so they would buy them from the landowner. And the landowner, right, the former plantation owner or the carpetbagger, would sell them the seed and sell them the plows and things at really high inflated prices. And they would say, well, we'll just add it to your rent. And so you'll pay this back as you give me your crops. Oh boy. Now, if and when they ever satisfied their rent and paid back for the seed and for the plows and stuff that they had used, any crops that were left over, they got to keep either for their own consumption or they could go out and sell it on their own. However, this entire process was so corrupt because very often when they would turn the crops over to the landowner, when the sharecroppers would turn their crops over to the landowner would sell it at really depressed prices, right? They would sell the crops for much lower than what it should be. And they would go back and say, well, we didn't get as much out of those crops that we thought we were going to get. We thought we were going to get $10. We only got $5. So you're still in debt. And if they couldn't pay their debt that year, if they couldn't pay their rent that year or pay for the implements, the seed that they used that year, it would be added on to next year's rent. So then the bill just begins to add up over time. Okay. And then once you're on the land, you can't leave until you've paid your rent. So if you didn't make enough money last year to pay your rent and it's added to this year's rent, right? You don't make enough money this year to pay off the rent from last year and this year, and that's added to next year, you're stuck there until you can pay it back. Oh boy. Add into this droughts, which happened, bug infestations, which happens a lot in the South. You get the cicadas and other things come in and they just locust and they just destroy your crops. Or you get floods or hurricanes or whatever come through and wipe out your crops. Well, that's just the way it is because you still got to pay rent. And since you didn't have any crops this year because of droughts or bugs or whatever, well, we'll just add it to next year. So you're stuck here for at least another year. Oh, and so a lot of former slaves, this is what they end up in because this is the only job that they can find. And it's the only job that a lot of them really only know how to do. And they end up working back on the land where they were once slaves for their former slave owners. And it's essentially slavery, just by another name. Whew. And a lot of poor whites also get trapped in this today, because this is all they could do. And it was just a horrible, horrible process that went on here. And it still exists today. There's some laws and things that control it, but there's still sharecropping today. All right. Meanwhile, back in Congress, in December of 1865, Republicans who control the Congress refused to seat a lot of Southern representatives who had been newly elected to Congress from the South, because they were former Confederates. And many of them came from states that just wouldn't ratify the 13th. So that's something that a lot of people don't know, right? Even though states elect representatives into the Congress or into the Senate, into the House of Representatives or into the Senate, doesn't mean they automatically get seated, because the other members of the Senate or the House of Representatives have to approve their seat. They actually take a vote and say, yep, we think these people are good people and we can trust them to do the right thing. And they were elected in a legal process by their constituents, will allow them to come in. But every once in a while, they're not allowed to come in. Every once in a while, Congress does vote against them. And that's what happens in 1865. A lot of these Southern representatives who were elected into Congress are not allowed to take their seats because they were former Confederate officials, and many of them came from states that would not ratify the 13th Amendment. Oh boy, this is starting to get messy. And then Radical Republicans set up a committee called the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. So there was members from the Senate, members from the House of Representatives, and it's this committee to figure out, like, how's Reconstruction going? Like, what's it like in the South? And they call forward all these witnesses and experts to testify about how it's going. It's not going well. It's actually going pretty terrible in the South. We got black codes. We've got, the Southern legislatures beginning to be dominated again by Confederate officials who are refusing essentially to accept that they lost the war. Oh boy. So because of how poorly Reconstruction is going, Congress passes the Civil Rights Bill in spring of 1865. And it does several different things, but the most important thing is it makes all freedmen, newly freed slaves, gives them rights of citizenship, makes them citizens of the United States, and allows black men, Southern black men, to vote. Ho, ho, ho. They also create this organization called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau was this government organization designed to help newly freed slaves kind of transfer from that being a slave to being free. And they set up schools to help them learn how to read and write and learn how to do other things other than working in the fields. Freedmen's Bureau also opens up a special court system to investigate how newly freed people, their rights were being denied to them by whites, right? For whites who are violating their rights or taking away the rights of newly freed people. So that's what the Freedmen's Bureau was this government organization set up to help former slaves transfer into being freedmen, educate them, set up a court system to protect their rights and prosecute those who are trying to deny them their rights. Johnson vetoes both of these bills. He vetoes the Civil Rights Bill, and then he vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau bill. And his argument is, look, you didn't let these Southern representatives come into Congress. You said they couldn't sit here. And now we're passing laws for the South. The South didn't have any say in the matter. This is like taxation without representation. This is the same argument, right? We didn't like it when England was passing laws on us, and we had no representation in Parliament. And now we're passing laws for the South, and they have no representation here. And he said it gives the government too much power, gives the federal government too much power on what happens in the states. So he vetoes both bills. Oh, boy. So the radical Republicans in Congress are so angry with Johnson. And they override his veto, which was pretty unheard of. It was an exceedingly rare event. And it still is today, but it was even more so back then, for Congress to override a presidential veto. But Congress does it, and they override both of Johnson's vetoes. And then a light goes off in Congress. Bing! Hey! It doesn't matter what Johnson does, because we can override everything that he does. If he vetoes every bill that we put out, we can override it. Congress now realizes that they are in control, that they have the power of what's going to happen in Reconstruction. And it shifts the Reconstruction, the focus of Reconstruction, from the White House, which is where it had been up to this point, Lincoln and Johnson, and now Congress is going to take control of Reconstruction because they've got the ability now to override anything and everything that Johnson does. Which leads us to our next stair-step amendment, right? The 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. You can't have slaves. So now the next step in this process is the 14th Amendment, which is passed on June 13th, 1866, which says, now, if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen. It does not matter what your status was prior to being born, right? If your parents were slaves and you were born a slave, doesn't matter now. If you were born in the United States, you are now a citizen of the United States. Period. 14th Amendment. That's the next step up. No slave. 13th Amendment, no slavery. Next step is you make them citizens. All right. So now Congress now tells the South, before you come back into the Union, you've got to approve both the 13th and 14th Amendment. Johnson, who realizes he's beginning to lose control here, he's beginning to lose a lot of power, begins to campaign throughout the country for conservative Republicans who would agree with him, and Democrats for the midterm elections, which are coming up in 1866. And very often, Johnson will just go off on these crazy rants about how radical Republicans are destroying the country and they're taking away the rights of Americans, and just these crazy tangents against radical Republicans. Midterm elections come, radical Republicans win more seats in Congress. So radical Republicans become even more powerful after the 1866 elections. And at this point, they're going to take full control of Reconstruction. And they pass what's known as the Military Reconstruction Act. And they're going to divide the South up into 5 different military districts, which you can see on the map here, how they're all divided up. Okay. Essentially, all these districts are going to be controlled and ruled and governed like conquered territories. Each district is going to have a military general who's going to have supreme power in these territories. This general will have the powers of a dictator, and they will control what happens and what doesn't happen. And they're going to have military troops patrolling the South like the South is a conquered territory, like we would in like we did in Nazi Germany following the end of World War II, where the United States Army was occupying force and had total control over what was happening right at the end of World War II. So how do the southern states get out of military control? A couple of things they have to do. They have to write a new state constitution saying they're not going to leave ever again. They have to approve that all black men in their state will have the ability to vote. They have to approve the 13th and 14th Amendment, and they have to make sure high-ranking Confederate officials do not get elected to office. If they can do those things, if they do all of those things, right, a new state constitution which says they will follow the laws of the United States and be loyal to the United States, give black men living in their state the right to vote, approve the 13th and 14th Amendments, outlawing slavery, making them citizens, and then say former Confederate officials can never hold office. If they do those things, they get out of military control. The general doesn't have dictatorial powers over them, and they become a full member of the country again. Johnson vetoes the bill. He vetoes other Reconstruction bills, other Freedmen's Bureau bills that are sent to him. He veto. All of these bills are overridden, but Congress has now had enough of Johnson. There is a real, tangible tension and anger with each other that's building up. Congress cannot stand Johnson. Johnson cannot stand Congress. And it's just this uncomfortable tension that's building up. Congress decides they've had enough of Johnson, and they set a trap to destroy Johnson's presidency. And this is a crazy, crazy, unbelievable story, what's about to happen. Congress passes this law called the Tenure of Office Act. Basically, what it says is the president cannot remove a member of his cabinet, right? Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Secretary, all these secretaries. He cannot remove a member of his cabinet until he's named a replacement for them, and that replacement has been approved by the Senate. This has never been done before, right? Always before, the president pretty much has complete control over who's in his cabinet, and he can fire whoever he wants at any time he wants, with or without a replacement. Every president has been able to do that before Johnson, and really after Johnson, every president will have that ability as well. This is just set up specifically for Johnson, and here's why. The Secretary of War, guy's name was Edward Stanton, and he was one of the few guys that held over from Lincoln into Johnson's administration. And Edwin Stanton was in charge, since he was the Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense now. He was the one who was going to be in charge of kind of overseeing the Military Reconstruction Act, where the military is going to go in and take over these different military districts and control them. Because Edwin Stanton was the Secretary of War, he would be the one who was ultimately responsible for making sure this was going to happen. Johnson vetoed that bill. The bill was overridden, and now Congress knows his next step, Johnson's next step, is going to try to get rid of Edwin Stanton. August of 1867, Congress goes on vacation, right? They leave Washington, D.C. There's literally nobody in Washington, D.C. except Johnson and a couple of government officials. During this time, Johnson fires Stanton and replaces him with Ulysses S. Grant, who was former Civil War general. Now, here's why he does it. Okay? Johnson or Grant is a good soldier, meaning he's going to do whatever he's told to do, right? He's told you're new Secretary of War and you're going to do what I want you to do. He's going to do it. January of 1868, Congress comes back. Johnson's walked right into their trap, right? Congress has come back and Johnson has walked right into their trap. And so Congress immediately overturned Stanton firing. They said, nope, Johnson, you violated the Tenure of Office Act. You did not have a replacement named and approved for Edwin Stanton before you fired him. So Edwin Stanton is back as Secretary of War. Grant leaves office. Stanton comes back in. Here's where it gets good and crazy. Johnson tries to assert his authority, and he tries to fire Stanton again. However, big problem. Edwin Stanton literally barricaded the door to his office. Like he pushed furniture in front of the door and locked the door so Johnson couldn't come in. If Johnson can't come in and fire Stanton, Stanton can never get fired, right? Johnson's got to come in and say, you're fired. But if he can't get into Stanton's office, he can't fire Stanton. So Stanton is literally barricaded himself in his office, and Johnson's outside the door. Boom, 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 boom. Open up! Open up! I need to come in. And Stanton's inside like, nobody's home, go away, right? Crazy, right? Stanton barricades his door so he cannot be fired. Meanwhile, Congress, who knows this is happening, drafts articles of impeachment against Johnson for violating the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson is very quickly and overwhelmingly impeached by the House of Representatives. Okay. Now remember how the impeachment process works. House of Representatives has to say, "Yup, the president broke the law. Yup, the president did something that was wrong." So they impeach him. Impeachment means you did something wrong. You broke the law. After that, it goes to the Senate, where the Senate is going to decide, did the law or whatever it is that the president did, was it serious enough to kick them out of office? So it goes to the Senate, which is overwhelmingly radical Republicans. Johnson knows his presidency is in real danger. So Johnson goes to the Senate and tells the Republicans, if you vote to not remove me from office, allow me to finish out my term as president, I will pass any and all Reconstruction bills that you send to me, and I will not seek re-election in 1868. And radical Republicans go, are you sure? Do you promise? And Johnson says, well, I cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. Of course I will. And because of this promise, Johnson is saved from being removed from office by one single vote. Oof. And Johnson becomes the first president to be impeached. There have since been two other presidents who have been impeached. There's Johnson, and then Clinton in 1998, and then Donald Trump just recently. Three presidents have been impeached. None of them have ever been removed from office. Johnson comes the closest. He's one vote away from being kicked out of office. All right, brings us to the election of 1868. Republicans nominate Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant, right? Americans love voting for Civil War heroes. So the Republicans say, Grant's our man. Yay! The Democrats choose a guy by the name of Horatio Seymour. Oh, really? Horatio Seymour? Well, you know that guy didn't have a shot. But Andrew Johnson does go back to being a Democrat and does campaign for the Democratic nomination of president in 1968. And he almost gets the nomination, but he doesn't. They go with Horatio Seymour because, I don't know, maybe they liked his name. Now, Grant wins the election, but it's a pretty close election. And he wins by a total of less than 300,000 votes. Woof! That's a pretty close total. The key that pushed Grant over the top, over Horatio Seymour, was that 450,000 votes were cast by newly freed black men in the South. 450,000 votes were cast for the first time by black men in the South, and almost all of them went for Grant. And that was the margin of victory for Grant, were those 450,000 votes by newly freed men in the South. Now, the Republicans look at that and go, woof, that's a lot, right? I mean, this is a new voting bloc that the Republicans have discovered. So Republicans now believe, since it was newly freed black men in the South who pushed Grant over the top, Republicans now begin to say, maybe we should extend this to all black men, not just African-American men in the South, but all African-American men in both the North and the South. Which brings us to our last of the stair-step amendments, the 15th Amendment, which is passed December 7th, 1868, which says all men, regardless of color, regardless of race, will be allowed to vote. If you're a dude and you're an adult, you can vote. So that's the stair step. 13th Amendment, you're no longer a slave. 14th Amendment, you're a citizen. 15th Amendment, now that you're free and a citizen, you can vote. Yay! Meanwhile, in the South, Southern legislatures, they begin to get taken over by carpetbaggers and racist legislatures, racist white legislators who are not interested in anything. They're not interested in the well-being of the South, and they're certainly not interested in the well-being of newly freed slaves. They're interested in how big their pockets get with money. And then there's these various organizations that begin to spring up, like the KKK becomes a very prominent organization for a period of time, who go throughout the South to terrorize blacks, to make sure that they don't vote and make sure that they don't participate fully in society. Now, the United States government does wage war. I mean, we kind of declared war on the KKK. KKK has a very brief, although meteoric rise, particularly in Texas. And the United States government, the military, basically declared war on the KKK and kind of put them down quite quickly. But fighting this war against the KKK and other organizations like them takes attention away, and more importantly, takes resources, money away from Reconstruction. So Reconstruction, which starts out gangbusters, is beginning to just kind of people are losing interest in it. 1872, Grant is reelected. And then economic depression. Factories begin to close. Banks are going out of business. Unemployment begins to climb. And it all goes back to railroads. Railroads are kind of the cause of this economic depression. But it's a really, really bad economic depression. The worst economic depression the United States has been in until the Great Depression of the 1930s. So now we're dealing with this economic reconstruction. We don't have a lot of money. We're trying to fix the economy. Interest in Reconstruction and money for Reconstruction is beginning to go away. right? This is a waning interest in Reconstruction. That's an important term. Hint, hint, winky, winky. APUSH test writers love that idea. The waning interest in Reconstruction, right? There's so many other things going on. This has been going on for so long. Let's just get it over with. The South is not happy because they're not getting any of the resources that they said they were going to get. They're still in the same shape that they were at the end of the Civil War. And they've got all these federal troops who are controlling everything that they do. Which brings us to 1876. Democrats believe for the first time they can win the White House. For the first time in a long time, in at least 16 years, the Democrats believe they have a real shot at winning the White House. Because of this economic depression, Grant's administration has lots of scandals. He's not involved in them, but a lot of his cabinet, a lot of his advisors are involved in various scandals. And then just Reconstruction, just this fatigue of Reconstruction in the Civil War. So 1876, Democrats believe, they got a shot. So it brings us to the presidential election of 1876. Republicans nominate another Civil War hero, because we love our war heroes, guy by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. The Democrats nominate a pretty moderate and a very well-liked, both by Republicans and Democrats, guy by the name of Samuel Tilden. All right, so in 1865, you needed 185 electoral votes to win presidency, right? There's less people. Today, you need 270. Back then, you needed 185 electoral votes. Rutherford B. Hayes gets 165. Samuel Tilden gets 184. Oh, boy. Nobody got enough! Oh! Now, there's some voting problems. The votes in Florida always seems to kind of screw up elections. Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon. There's some real questions about the votes there, about how the votes were cast, how the votes were counted. Right? Sounds kind of familiar, right? So these states account for 20 electoral votes. If Hayes gets all of these, he becomes president. If Tilden gets one of these, he'll be president. Now, here's a kind of an interesting factoid for y'all. Colorado becomes a state in 1876. One of the reasons that Colorado becomes a state in 1876, and it's a pretty quick path for Colorado from being a territory, which we become a territory during the 1860s, to statehood. It's a really quick path. Usually states, it's a long process to go from being a territory to being a state. Colorado is on the fast track to become a state. And the reason is Republicans wanted Colorado to be able to vote in the 1876 presidential election. Colorado was a very, very, very hardcore Republican state at that time, and Republicans wanted those votes. So they really, really pushed through Colorado statehood so that Colorado could vote in the presidential election in 1876. And that's why Colorado is known as a centennial state. We become a state on August 1st, 1876, so we could vote in the presidential election. All right, so we've got this kind of weird tie. Ordinarily, it would go to the House of Representatives for this to be broken. South is not happy about that. Nobody's real happy about that. So Congress decides, well, let's do something different. Let's make this commission of 13 people. And this group of 13 people will decide who gets the votes. So here's what this commission looks like. There's 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. Well, I wonder how this is going to go. The 8 Republicans, in a vote of 8-7, it is decided that Samuel Tilden will not become president. In a vote to 8-7, it is decided that the 20 electoral votes from Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon will all go to Rutherford B. Hayes, giving him 185 so he can be president. The South has had it, right? The South goes, that's enough. How many times do we have to go through this with the North? North goes, no. Let's work out a deal. So we get to compromise of 1877. Hayes will get all 20 votes and become president. If the South agrees to this, all federal troops will be withdrawn from the South and Reconstruction will end. We're going to give money to the South to make money or to make internal improvements, to build roads and bridges and dams and factories and railroads. We're going to give the South all this stuff. Rutherford B. Hayes will promise to appoint a Southerner to his cabinet, which he does. And the South agrees. So this ends the Civil War. The South comes back into the Union after the Compromise of 1877. They get money to rebuild. They get money for internal improvements. And the slaves may be free, but they're definitely not equal, and they're definitely not treated as such. There are things happening in the South that will keep African Americans from fully participating as equal Americans. And it's going to take another 100 years. It won't be until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s that will fix a lot of those problems coming out of the Civil War. And because of this, a lot of people argue that the South may have lost the Civil War, but the South really ended up winning the most important war, because they get all sorts of internal improvements. They get to come back into the country. Confederate officials can continue to be elected to office. And they can continue to treat their former slaves as second-class citizens. The South really doesn't lose a whole lot here other than slavery. And so a lot of historians argue that the South actually ended up winning the Civil War. All right. So there's a broad overview of Reconstruction. My least favorite thing, God, do I hate Reconstruction. A lot of stuff happens, but very little changes, and it won't be until another 100 years that really we get the full change. So there you go, way pushers. Have a good day.